I sat in the quiet of my study, the envelope heavy in my hand, feeling the weight of all the things I had never said. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind. Keep quiet today. Say nothing until the reading. I had rehearsed every possible reaction, every smile, every careful pause, and still my stomach churned with anticipation. Today was supposed to be ordinary, yet the air itself seemed taut, holding a secret that could unravel everything. Before we step further into this, I want to ask you something. Have you ever carried a truth so heavy, knowing that revealing it might change the people you love forever, yet remained silent because the timing had to be perfect? I straightened my coat and stepped into the room, noting the subtle shifts of everyone's eyes as they glanced at me. A small, expectant murmur rippled across the gathered faces. I could feel the tension tighten like a cord around my chest. Then, with trembling fingers, I handed over the envelope, and the room went silent. That pause, the stillness of unspoken words, felt louder than any argument I had ever endured. The room remained frozen for a few heartbeats after I handed over the envelope. The silence was heavier than any argument I had ever endured, thick enough to press against my chest, yet fragile, like it might crack at any moment. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, forcing myself to stay composed, but my mind raced. What exactly were they thinking? Were they guessing at the contents, imagining the worst, or simply stunned by the audacity of my calm? I stepped slightly back, letting the envelope rest fully in the hands of the lawyer, and allowed myself a small, measured breath. It felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, the ground underneath uncertain, yet knowing that one small step had set something irreversible in motion. The faces around me were familiar, yet every glance now seemed sharpened, charged with expectations I could not see clearly. Each person reacted differently, a twitch of a lip, a slight tightening of the jaw, a hand brushing against a knee. In those tiny movements, entire histories were being rewritten. As I looked around, my memory drifted back to the moments that had led here. I remembered late nights in my study, the quiet hum of the heater, the faint smell of old papers mixed with the scent of coffee. I had stared at this envelope countless times, debating whether I was doing the right thing. Could a single gesture, this small, folded piece of paper, really carry the weight of so many years, of so many silences and misunderstandings? I had wrestled with that question endlessly, pacing across the worn rug, testing the envelope's weight in my hand, imagining each reaction and its ripple across the family. In the past, conflict had always been louder, easier to see. Arguments erupted, voices were raised, and yet resolutions were temporary, fragile, and often unsatisfying. This silence was different. It was sharper, subtler, but more consequential. I could feel it in the tightness of my own chest, in the shallow way I breathed, in the awareness that every eye was now on me, waiting for the next cue, the first word that would break the tension. I remembered the lawyer's instructions clearly. Say nothing. Not a word, not a hint, not a gesture beyond what was necessary to hand over the envelope. The responsibility felt like a thin line I had to walk carefully. One misstep, one flinch, could ruin everything. That advice had been easy to ignore in theory, but impossible to follow in practice. Silence demanded more discipline than confrontation ever had, and I was learning just how taxing it could be. From my pocket, I felt the familiar contour of the envelope, the slight ridge where it had been folded so meticulously. I had prepared it with precision, but it was never the physical act of folding that mattered. It was the thought, the intention, the timing. That small paper held years of decisions, regrets, and unspoken truths, all compressed into something tangible yet almost deceptively simple. And now, it was out of my hands. I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the room, a hand brushing against a chair as though testing for reaction. A quiet clearing of the throat followed. I realized that this moment was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone present, and each of us would carry the consequences differently. I tried to keep my gaze neutral, scanning each face without letting any emotion betray what I was feeling inside. Fear, anticipation, hope, guilt. They all competed for attention, but I had learned to hold them at bay, to let them simmer quietly beneath the surface. The quiet stretched, and I felt an almost physical pressure from the anticipation. Everyone was waiting, the envelope acting as a fulcrum around which the entire room now pivoted. My mind wandered to what might be going through their heads. Were they reflecting on past grievances, on old misunderstandings, on the trust, or lack thereof, that had brought us here? I could almost hear the internal dialogue of each person, the silent calculation of how to respond, whether to react immediately or with measured caution. I realized in that moment that this silence was doing something that confrontation never could. It was forcing reflection, demanding that each person account for their own assumptions, their own history before speaking. The envelope had become a mirror, showing not just what was inside it, but who we had all become over the years, the choices we had made, the words we had left unsaid, the resentments quietly harbored. My thoughts returned to my own journey, the preparation, the hesitation, the oral questioning. I had wanted clarity, resolution, perhaps even a chance to redeem some long-forgotten moment. I had wondered if a single act of measured revelation could replace years of argument and misunderstanding. Could silence be stronger than words? Could one simple gesture redefine relationships that had long seemed fixed? And then I noticed the first sign of change, a subtle shift in posture, a slight narrowing of eyes, a small exhale that had not been there before. The room was still quiet, yet the tension had shifted. The envelope had done its work. It had commanded attention, forced pause, demanded consideration. And in that stillness, I felt the first real stirrings of anticipation, the awareness that this was no longer just about me, or even about what was inside the envelope. It was about how truth, carefully delivered, could reshape the contours of our lives without a single raised voice. The room's stillness lingered, but my mind began to wander into the corridors of memory. I could no longer remain fully in the present, caught between the tension of what had just happened and the echoes of choices that had led me here. That envelope had carried years of quiet deliberation, moments of doubt, and decisions I had kept to myself because speaking out before now could have undone everything. Each step toward today had been calculated, measured, and yet I could not escape the lingering question of whether my silence would be enough to make them understand. I remembered sitting alone at the kitchen table just a week ago, reviewing documents I had thought I would never touch. The faint hum of the refrigerator was a companion to my thoughts, each sound grounding me in the solitude that had become my refuge. I had written notes, folded and unfolded the envelope countless times, considering how to balance honesty with discretion. I had asked myself what justice read pass. Ellie meant, whether it was to reveal the whole truth or to guide them toward their own realization. That question had haunted me more than any fear of confrontation. The lawyer's voice replayed in my mind, calm but firm. Remain silent until the moment arrives. I had nodded, agreeing in theory, yet in practice, the discipline required seemed nearly impossible. How could I restrain myself when I could sense the undercurrents in the room, the curiosity, the doubt, the impatience that radiated from every glance? I had learned early on that words could inflame more than they could clarify. Silence, on the other hand, held a strange authority, demanding attention without explanation. That realization had shaped my preparation, even if it also left me questioning whether I was strong enough to sustain it. Flashbacks carried me further back to my earliest moments of doubt, to conversations I had almost had but didn't, out of fear of misunderstanding. There had been minor incidents, small betrayals, misunderstandings that seemed trivial at the time but now appeared as part of a pattern. Those tiny cracks in communication had made me wary of immediate disclosure. I had learned that even the truth, if poorly timed, could wound instead of heal. Each recollection strengthened my conviction that today, silence would speak louder than any argument or explanation. I noticed the subtle tension in the room again, as if everyone present were collectively holding their breath. It was not an anger I could see, but a careful, measured anticipation, a sense that something was about to happen without knowing exactly what. I realized that my role was no longer to direct the outcome but to observe how the silence affected them, to watch how the envelope would alter perceptions and force reflection. It was a strange and humbling position to hold such influence with nothing more than a simple, deliberate act. The envelope itself felt almost weightless in my hand, yet its significance pressed down on me in ways that physical objects never could. I had spent long evenings considering what to include, what to omit, how to phrase even the smallest detail so that the intended message would reach the right people without misinterpretation. In this careful preparation, I had wrestled with every possible reaction: the resentment that might flare, the disbelief that could paralyze, and even the possibility of admiration or understanding. Each imagined outcome reminded me of the fragility of human perception and how a single act could ripple through relationships in ways I could neither fully predict nor control. Looking around, I began to notice subtle hints of unease that I had previously overlooked. A chair shifted under someone's weight, a hand fiddled with a cuff, eyes flicked away quickly and returned with cautious scrutiny. Every small gesture was magnified in the vacuum of silence, carrying with it volumes of unspoken meaning. I understood now that this quiet was not empty. It was charged with expectation, with the possibility of revelation, with the collective consciousness of everyone in the room. I thought of the past again, of moments when I had spoken prematurely and suffered the consequences. Words had once cut deeper than any action, leaving scars that lasted long after the moment passed. Today I was attempting something different, to let timing and silence carry the weight that words could not bear. It was not a game, nor was it a performance. It was a calculated measure of restraint, a test of whether people could face truth without needing it explained to them. Even as I observed, I could feel a subtle shift in myself. The nervous tension that had accompanied the preparation weeks ago had evolved into a sharp focus. My mind was alive with possibilities, but my body remained calm, grounded, aware of the presence of others, yet detached enough to watch the emotional undercurrents. I was learning that observation, patience, and restraint could be more powerful than direct confrontation. I also realized that this silence was teaching me something I had not expected: empathy. By allowing others the space to react, to interpret, and to question, I was witnessing their inner lives in real time. Each subtle reaction revealed more about them than any argument or explanation ever could. Their assumptions, hopes, fears, and misjudgments were exposed not through words but through their own responses, and I was a quiet observer in this unfolding drama. As the minutes stretched on, I felt the weight of anticipation grow heavier, yet more controlled. The envelope had already done its work, commanding attention without a single word. I wondered if they were beginning to grasp the significance of what I had given them. Perhaps some were sensing the careful thought, the intention behind the silence, while others remained oblivious, lost in their own interpretations. That ambiguity, I realized, was part of the power of measured revelation. I took a slow, deliberate breath and allowed myself a brief reflection on why I had chosen this path. Every moment of hesitation, every private deliberation, every careful preparation had led to this point. I had considered how the silence would feel, how the envelope might speak without speaking, how it could shift dynamics without confrontation. And now, in the quiet, I felt a sense of quiet validation, not triumph, not relief, but acknowledgement that sometimes restraint could hold more meaning than immediate action. Even as I remained in the room, part of me continued to drift through past choices, revisiting the doubts and fears that had accompanied preparation. Would they understand the intention? Would they misinterpret it entirely? Was the silence a bridge or a wall? These questions lingered, unresolved, forming a backdrop to the quiet tension that still enveloped the space. I sensed that the unfolding moments would carry the answers, and yet the power to witness, to remain still, was as important as any revelation contained in the envelope itself. The silence began to feel almost tangible, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I realized the envelope had already shifted the room in subtle ways I had not anticipated. Eyes that once held casual indifference now flickered with suspicion, calculation, or something unspoken I could not yet name. It was strange how a simple piece of paper could unsettle long-standing patterns, how it could act as a quiet disruptor without a single word being spoken. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. I had controlled the timing, but not the reactions, and that uncertainty was heavier than I expected. My mind wandered back to earlier decisions, to moments when I had wrestled with the morality of disclosure. I remembered nights of quiet contemplation, lit only by a small desk lamp, as I considered the consequences of my actions. Each choice had felt like a balancing act, what to reveal, what to withhold, how to preserve dignity while ensuring understanding. I had questioned whether anyone would grasp the intention behind the envelope or whether it would be misread entirely, amplifying old tensions instead of resolving them. I noticed subtle gestures in the room that hinted at shifting power dynamics. A hand rested on a table, fingers drumming lightly, betraying impatience. A pair of eyes darted toward someone else, then back to me, as if searching for clues in my expression. I realized then that the envelope had not only carried the truth, but had become a mirror for everyone present, reflecting fears, assumptions, and expectations. The way people reacted, or didn't react, spoke volumes about their own histories and the silent agreements we had made over the years. I remembered an afternoon months ago reviewing documents in solitude, considering the exact words to include in the envelope. I had rewritten phrases repeatedly, weighing clarity against subtlety, honesty against discretion. Every sentence was carefully measured, intended not just to convey information, but to provoke reflection. I had known that once it was delivered, the envelope would act as both catalyst and mirror, revealing not just the content, but the character of those who received it. That knowledge gave me a strange sense of control, though it also reminded me of how little control one ever truly has over human response. The quiet stretched on, punctuated only by subtle signs of awareness, shifts in posture, barely perceptible inhalations, a fleeting glance toward the door. Each small motion seemed amplified, each micro-expression a message I could barely interpret. I realized that the room itself had become a stage for internal dramas, an arena in which the envelope had already begun to rewrite the narrative without a single uttered word. Observing these reactions, I felt a mixture of anticipation and detachment. I had prepared for confrontation, but what I was witnessing was subtler, more revealing, and ultimately more profound. I thought back to my own hesitations leading up to this moment. The fear of misinterpretation had weighed heavily on me. I had considered whether silence would be enough or whether I needed to guide the conversation afterward. In the end, I chose restraint, trusting that careful preparation and timing could achieve something that words alone could not. It was a lesson in patience, one I had learned through years of experience, and now it was being tested in real time under the watchful eyes of those whose judgment mattered most. As I studied the faces around me, I noticed that reactions were beginning to diverge. Some appeared puzzled, trying to piece together the implications. Others seemed defensive, bracing for criticism or judgment. A few looked inward, as though reflecting on their own roles in past conflicts and misunderstandings. It struck me how a single act, delivered with precision and care, could prompt such a wide range of emotional responses. It was a quiet demonstration of human complexity, of the way perception and interpretation shape reality more than any explicit declaration ever could. The envelope had also forced me to confront my own emotions, to examine the mixture of hope, anxiety, and vindication I carried. I had imagined different outcomes countless times: anger, tears, acknowledgement, or even complete misunderstanding. And yet, in the stillness of this room, I realized that the moment was less about my expectations and more about allowing others the space to confront their own assumptions. It was a subtle shift in perspective, but one that had taken years of experience to recognize. My thoughts drifted briefly to past misunderstandings, times when I had spoken too soon or acted too quickly, only to watch the situation deteriorate. Those experiences had taught me the value of timing, of letting events unfold naturally, and of giving people the chance to process truth in their own way. The envelope, in its quiet simplicity, embodied that philosophy. It was not a weapon, nor a test of loyalty. It was a careful gesture, intended to reveal, provoke, and allow for self-reflection. Even as I observed, I could feel a subtle shift within myself. The initial tension had given way to a focused awareness, a sense that I was witnessing something far larger than any single conflict. I was seeing patterns, reactions, and unspoken truths that would have been invisible amid argument or explanation. The envelope had become more than a container of information. It was a lens through which I could understand the people around me and, by extension, myself. I recalled the countless hours of planning and hesitation that had brought me here, each decision building toward this precise moment. I had wrestled with the moral implications, questioned my motivations, and considered the potential fallout. And now, as I observed the room, I recognized the power of deliberate, thoughtful action. The envelope had achieved its purpose, but the real work, the understanding, the reconciliation, the reckoning, was only beginning. I felt a flicker of anticipation as I considered what might come next. How would each person interpret the contents? Would they see the intention behind the silence, or would they focus only on the immediate implications? The answers were unknowable, yet the process itself was revealing. Each reaction, each pause, each subtle shift in expression was part of the unfolding story, and I was both participant and observer in this intricate dance. In that quiet, I also realized something about myself. The preparation, the restraint, and the willingness to let others confront their own assumptions had taught me a new form of patience. I had learned that influence does not always come through force or argument, but through timing, careful intention, and the courage to step back while the world responds. The envelope was a vessel, yes, but it was also a mirror of everything we had become and everything we still had to face together. The weight of silence continued to settle over the room, each second stretching longer than the last. I could see subtle shifts in posture, a twitch of the hand, a subtle tightening of lips, signs that people were processing more than the envelope itself. Their eyes flicked toward one another, searching for unspoken cues, for confirmation of suspicions, or perhaps solidarity. In that stillness, the air seemed charged with questions no one dared voice, and I found myself observing not just their reactions, but the space between them, the tension that existed where words could not reach. I thought back to the moment when the envelope had been prepared, the painstaking attention I had given to every word and every line. Each phrase had been assigned to provoke reflection rather than accusation, to illuminate rather than condemn. I remembered the nights spent alone, imagining their faces as they read, wondering whether anyone would notice the care and intention behind the simplicity. In hindsight, I realized that preparation had been as much for myself as for them, a way to steady my nerves, to gain clarity on what truth really meant in the context of family. Watching them now, I began to notice patterns I had not anticipated. Some shifted in defensive postures, crossing arms or glancing away. Others seemed quieter, thoughtful, as if the envelope had prompted them to revisit memories, to weigh actions against consequences. I understood then that silence could be more revealing than speech. Every glance, every hesitation, every pause carried meaning. I felt the curious mixture of relief and apprehension that comes when you witness the power of a single gesture unfold in ways you cannot fully control. I recalled times in the past when family conflicts had escalated unnecessarily because words were spoken too quickly, too harshly, or without thought for the underlying truths. This time was different. I had intentionally allowed space for reflection, and the effect was already apparent. I watched as people began to process, some struggling with denial, others confronting discomfort. It was fascinating to observe how a single deliberate act, delivered with care and patience, could reveal both character and history in such vivid detail. The quiet also gave me time to reflect on my own motivations, the mix of hope, doubt, and caution that had guided me to this moment. I had spent years wrestling with the balance between honesty and discretion, and now, in this room, I could see that the choice to remain silent until the right moment was proving its worth. Every reaction, however subtle, reinforced the idea that timings, and patience often carry more impact than words alone. I felt a quiet sense of vindication, tempered by the awareness that understanding would come in layers and perhaps over time, rather than all at once. As I observed, I noticed a subtle tension in the room that suggested the first cracks were forming in long-held assumptions. Someone's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of recognition passing through them before quickly shifting away. Another leaned forward slightly, as if to read between the lines, to search for hidden meaning. The envelope, though still closed, had already begun its work. It had become a catalyst for reflection, a mirror held up to each individual, forcing them to confront assumptions and behaviors they might otherwise have ignored. My thoughts wandered to the delicate balance between revelation and confrontation. I had feared that revealing too much too soon could ignite resentment rather than reflection. Conversely, I had also known that leaving things unsaid indefinitely could perpetuate misunderstanding. The solution, I had concluded, was to create an opening for awareness without forcing it, to allow the act itself, the envelope, the timing, the silence, to prompt introspection. I could see now that this approach was already beginning to work, and the first signs were subtle but unmistakable. The room seemed to breathe collectively, as though the tension had created its own rhythm. Each small movement, each glance exchanged between family members, carried unspoken weight. I noticed how the quiet forced people to confront their own assumptions, their own guilt, and their own misjudgments. The envelope had shifted the center of gravity in the room, creating a space where reflection was inevitable. I felt a sense of quiet pride, not in control, but in having facilitated the conditions for understanding. Even as I observed, I felt a surge of memory from previous family interactions, moments when I had spoken prematurely and watched trust erode. Those experiences had taught me the value of restraint, and now, witnessing the subtle unraveling and reconstruction of perceptions, I understood how patience and timing could achieve outcomes far more powerful than direct confrontation. The envelope was a tool, yes, but it was also a lesson in human nature and in the quiet power of deliberate, thoughtful action. I began to see individual reactions in sharper relief. Some faces betrayed disbelief, others quiet contemplation, a few hints of grudging respect or acknowledgement. I realized that the act of withholding immediate explanation had allowed each person to engage with the content on their own terms. They were not reacting to me, but to the implications, and that made every response more authentic, more revealing, and more meaningful. I felt the room shift subtly, as if collective comprehension was beginning to emerge from the stillness. Looking at them, I recognized the fragile nature of understanding and trust. The envelope had prompted questions, but answers would need to be discovered by each person individually. It would not be a single moment of clarity, but a gradual unfolding. That realization brought a strange comfort. The work of reflection was not mine to direct, only to facilitate. I felt a growing sense of responsibility tempered by patience, knowing that the process of comprehension was as important as the revelation itself. I thought again about the intentions behind my actions. Every choice I had made, the wording, the timing, the decision to remain silent, was aimed at creating a space for honesty and awareness. The room's reactions confirmed that careful, measured preparation could indeed shape outcomes without coercion. Observing the interplay of hesitation, curiosity, and tentative recognition, I understood that subtlety often carried more weight than overt confrontation. By the time I allowed myself to glance around once more, I could see that the initial shock had evolved into something quieter, more reflective. The envelope had done more than convey information. It had reshaped perceptions and prompted inner reckoning. I felt a mixture of anticipation and patience, aware that the most profound realizations were yet to come. My role as observer, facilitator, and silent guide was far from over, and I sensed that the unfolding moments would continue to reveal truths far beyond the contents of a single envelope. The tension in the room shifted almost imperceptibly, but I could feel it tightening like a coil around each of us. There was a subtle energy now, one born not of words but of anticipation. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for someone to act, to speak, to break the quiet, but no one did. I realized in that moment that the envelope had done its job. It had created a pause long enough for reflection, long enough for each person to confront their own role in the dynamics that had brought us here. I thought back to the countless times I had been caught in similar family standoffs, when emotions had overtaken logic and words had been weaponized. Those moments had always ended in regret, with bridges burned and misunderstandings deepened. But this time was different. I had deliberately delayed the confrontation, allowing the silence to work its magic. I could sense that each person was wrestling with their own memories, their own assumptions, and the subtle truths that had always been lurking beneath polite conversation. My eyes scanned the room again. I noticed a hand nervously twisting a ring, a slight furrow of a brow, a fleeting glance that lingered just a fraction too long. These tiny gestures revealed more than any declaration ever could. The envelope was not just a vessel of information, it was a lens, revealing the intricate web of loyalties, grievances, and unspoken resentments that had been building for years. Watching it unfold was both exhilarating and exhausting. I felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that how I navigated the next moments could shape understanding or ignite further tension. I remembered the careful deliberation that had gone into preparing the envelope. Every phrase had been weighed, every line considered for clarity, neutrality, and impact. I had thought about the timing, the placement, and the potential for misinterpretation. And now, as I observed the room, I could see the fruits of that planning. People were thinking, reconsidering, processing. The envelope had not forced a reaction, it had invited contemplation. That subtle distinction mattered. It allowed me to remain quiet, to watch, and to understand how truth and perception interacted in ways I could not fully predict. The atmosphere was heavy, but not oppressive. There was a sense that something important was unfolding, something that required patience and presence. I could see a few individuals exchange cautious glances, as if silently negotiating who would speak first. Others seemed lost in thought, revisiting past conflicts, past misunderstandings, and past moments when things had gone unspoken. I recognized that the envelope had become a mirror, reflecting not just its contents, but the emotional history of our family, the choices, the regrets, the sacrifices, and the resentments that had quietly accumulated over time. I felt a twinge of anxiety despite my preparation. Would my intentions be recognized? Would the silence be interpreted as manipulation or care? These questions swirled in my mind, but I reminded myself that this moment was not about control. It was about allowing understanding to emerge naturally. I had learned over the years that forcing insight rarely worked. Reflection had to be earned, discovered, and internalized. And now, witnessing their reactions, I could see that process beginning in real time. Subtle movements continued to catch my attention. Someone shifted in their seat, leaning slightly forward, eyes narrowing as if searching for hidden meaning. Another folded arms and looked down, perhaps wrestling with guilt or recognition. The envelope had sparked something deeper than curiosity. It had ignited introspection. I realized then that the pause itself was a powerful instrument, shaping thought and feeling without a single word. The quiet was not empty. It was alive with potential, tension, and possibility. I remembered the lessons I had learned from earlier family conflicts, lessons in patience, in restraint, in timing. Those experiences had taught me that confrontation alone rarely resolved anything. Understanding required space, thought, and sometimes discomfort. The envelope had created that space. As I watched, I noticed the room's energy beginning to shift from tension to contemplation. People were processing, evaluating, and reconsidering. I felt a sense of cautious optimism, tempered by the knowledge that true reconciliation would take time, not a single moment of revelation. The envelope had also prompted me to reflect inwardly. I thought about my motivations, my fears, and the careful steps I had taken to ensure fairness. This was not about triumph or revenge. It was about truth, clarity, and dignity. Observing the room, I could see that others were being forced to confront similar reflections, realizations about their own actions, assumptions, and responsibilities. The subtlety of the moment made it all the more profound because understanding was being earned, not dictated. As time passed, I could feel the first stirrings of dialogue emerging in the room, not explicit, but in glances, gestures, and micro-expressions. The envelope had set the stage, creating a moment where careful attention and introspection were required. I felt a mix of anticipation and reassurance. The moment had been carefully orchestrated, yet the reactions were genuine, unpredictable, and revealing in ways I had only hoped for. Even now, I could sense that the envelope had accomplished more than I had anticipated. It had revealed patterns of thought, hidden regrets, and long-suppressed awareness. I noticed subtle signs of acknowledgement in some, while others wrestled with the implications of what had been shared. The room was a living tableau of human emotion and reflection, and I was both observer and participant in its quiet unfolding. I considered the broader implications of this moment. Beyond the immediate reactions, the envelope had initiated a ripple effect, a process that would continue long after the room emptied. Understanding, reflection, and perhaps eventual reconciliation would emerge slowly, but the first steps had been taken. I felt the quiet satisfaction of having created a space where truth could be considered without coercion, a space where dignity could be preserved even amid tension. The envelope had been delivered, and the quiet that followed was thick, almost tangible. I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on every person in the room, yet it was more than just expectation. It was a reckoning. I sensed that beneath the composed faces, internal battles were being waged. Old grudges, unspoken regrets, and half-forgotten memories were all colliding silently, each one amplified by the deliberate stillness I had orchestrated. I stayed seated, my hands resting on my knees, feeling the tension ripple through the room like an invisible current. I thought about the years of preparation that had led to this precise moment. It wasn't just the envelope itself, but the careful consideration of timing, phrasing, and subtle cues that had set the stage. I had rehearsed countless variations in my mind, how they might react, what questions they could ask, what defenses might arise. But the unpredictability of human emotion meant that no rehearsal could account for every reaction. Even now, I found myself learning, observing, and adjusting my understanding of each family member in real time. One glance caught my attention. A cousin I hadn't spoken with in years shifted slightly, eyes narrowing as if trying to read hidden intentions. Another, a younger relative, kept fiddling with the edge of their sleeve, a nervous tick betraying curiosity and perhaps a hint of fear. Everyone's body language was telling its own story, silently revealing feelings they had yet to articulate. I realized then that the envelope had become less a message and more a mirror, reflecting not only truths, but insecurities, biases, and assumptions. I reflected on the quiet lessons that had accompanied me through decades of family interactions. I had learned that confrontation could be corrosive if poorly timed, and that revelation often carried more impact when delivered subtly. The envelope was the embodiment of that philosophy. It demanded attention without demanding a response. It invited contemplation without prescribing conclusions. And already I could see its effect. The first stirrings of acknowledgement, the first hints of introspection, the beginning of understanding. I remember at specific moments from my own life when silence had spoken louder than words. Times when a look, a pause, or a simple gesture had changed the course of conversations, altered perceptions, and revealed unspoken truths. This moment was no different. I felt the responsibility of that silence keenly. Every subtle movement, every hesitation, every fleeting expression mattered. The room had transformed into a space of quiet examination, where each individual confronted not only the envelope but their own complicity in patterns of behavior that had long gone unchallenged. The initial shock of receiving the envelope had begun to settle, replaced now by the slow, methodical process of mental sifting. People were weighing, reconsidering, and connecting the dots of past grievances with present realizations. I noticed a parent glance toward a sibling, an almost imperceptible raise of the eyebrow hinting at both recognition and doubt. These small human gestures carried more weight than any argument or accusation. I felt a sense of relief tempered with vigilance. The journey of understanding had begun, and it was unfolding with its own rhythm. I found myself recalling the early warnings I had ignored in the past, the times when family tension had escalated because assumptions went unexamined and truths were delayed. This time I had deliberately inverted that pattern. The envelope and the pause that followed were designed to provoke thought rather than immediate reaction, to guide introspection rather than conflict. It was fascinating to watch the subtle dynamics of engagement emerge, the way some individuals leaned in, silently probing, while others leaned back, absorbed in reflection. I noticed that the tension was not evenly distributed. Some were grappling with guilt, others with denial, and a few with dawning awareness. I observed as eyes met briefly and quickly darted away, hands clenched lightly, brows furrowed, mouths twitching in the faintest attempts at self-control. Every motion, no matter how small, revealed layers of unspoken emotion. I felt a sense of cautious hope, understanding that awareness often precedes reconciliation, and that true reflection rarely occurs in a single instant. The envelope had sparked more than curiosity. It had ignited a process. I sensed that some individuals were already connecting threads, revisiting past arguments, misunderstandings, and assumptions. The quiet had become an instrument of revelation, a tool for insight. I felt proud, not in dominance, but in the subtle achievement of creating conditions where reflection could flourish without interference. Observing this, I understood that patience and subtlety often produced more profound impact than direct confrontation. Even as I remained silent, I felt a tug at my conscience. I wondered whether my approach might be too cautious, whether some would misinterpret the pause as indifference or manipulation. But I reminded myself that meaningful change rarely comes from coercion. The envelope had done its work by demanding reflection rather than dictating action. Already I could perceive the first cracks in long-held assumptions, tiny openings where understanding might one day take root. I continued to observe, my mind tracing connections and considering future steps. The room was alive with unspoken dialogue, each participant wrestling with their own history, their own misjudgments, and the possibilities of acknowledgement. I felt the quiet satisfaction of seeing truth unfold without interference, the delicate dance of revelation taking place in real time. The subtlety was everything. It allowed for genuine introspection rather than performative responses. By the time I glanced around again, I could see that the room had entered a new phase. The initial shock and curiosity had evolved into contemplation, self-assessment, and tentative understanding. Some faces showed recognition of past faults, others the struggle of confronting uncomfortable truths. And though no one had yet spoken, I knew the envelope had initiated a chain reaction that could lead to conversations far more honest and meaningful than any I could have forced. The quiet lingered, heavier now than before, almost tangible in the air. I could feel it pressing against me as if the room itself were waiting, holding its breath, testing my patience. There was a subtle shift in the energy. The initial curiosity had deepened into something more profound. People were no longer just observing, they were confronting themselves. Eyes darted, lips pressed together, and subtle movements revealed more than words ever could. Each glance, each micro-expression seemed magnified under the tension, revealing hidden histories, long-suppressed emotions, and the cracks in relationships that had been covered with politeness for far too long. I thought back to all the moments that had led here, the years of sacrifices, the miscommunications, and the silent grudges that had accumulated over decades. Family dynamics are never simple. They are a mixture of love, resentment, expectation, and disappointment. And now, as I sat quietly watching, I realized how much the envelope had accomplished without me speaking a single word. It was as if the silence itself had spoken louder than anything I could have said. Each person was forced to reckon with their own understanding, and I sensed that truth, clarity, and perhaps even a glimmer of humility were beginning to emerge. The envelope, unassuming in its appearance, carried weight far beyond its paper and ink. Every carefully chosen word inside had been a seed, planted to evoke reflection rather than provoke argument. I had thought carefully about timing, phrasing, and even placement. Every detail mattered because I knew that subtlety could yield far greater insight than overt confrontation. I could see it now, the effect of that careful planning, in the way people shifted in their seats, their expressions betraying thought processes that were both introspective and conflicted. As I observed, my mind wandered to earlier family conflicts, where quick words or misplaced accusations had escalated into months of distance and silence. The envelope and the quiet it created were a deliberate departure from that pattern. Here, no one was being forced to react immediately. Everyone was invited to consider, to reflect, and to acknowledge, if they were willing, to truths that had always lingered unspoken. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction knowing that the conditions for meaningful dialogue had been laid, even if no one had yet spoken. One cousin, in particular, caught my attention. He had always been quick to judge and quicker to dismiss, often hiding discomfort with a veneer of indifference. Now his hands were tightly clasped, eyes fixed downward, lips pressed in contemplation. I wondered what memories or regrets were surfacing in his mind, which long-standing assumptions he was finally beginning to challenge. The envelope had a subtle way of holding people accountable to their own consciences, revealing where silence had once been a shield or a weapon. I would sense that some family members were struggling with conflicting emotions, curiosity, guilt, pride, and even relief. Their body language gave them away. Tapping fingers, restless feet, fleeting eye contact, small nods. These subtle movements spoke volumes, telling stories of confrontation that were as internal as they were external. I remained still, listening not to words but to the weight of reflection pressing against the room like a tide, rising and pulling each person inward toward their own revelations. The longer the silence lasted, the more palpable the tension became. Yet it was not oppressive. It was transformative. I noticed that some individuals were beginning to make small, unconscious gestures of acknowledgement, a softening of the eyes, a tentative glance toward someone they had previously dismissed, a slight relaxation in posture. It was remarkable to witness how reflection could reshape a room, how unspoken truths could settle into awareness, quietly preparing the ground for conversation and perhaps eventually understanding. I thought about the irony of human behavior, how often the loudest words fail to resonate, while the quietest gestures leave lasting impact. The envelope, in its simplicity, had demonstrated that truth and accountability could emerge without force, without confrontation, and without immediate clarity. It was a lesson I had learned over years of observing and navigating family dynamics. The most profound change often comes not from insistence, but from invitation. Even as I sat observing, I felt the slow, subtle shifts in relationships taking root. The envelope had opened a door, and though the path forward was uncertain, the first steps had been taken. I recognized that some would need more time than others, that some might resist acknowledgement entirely, and that some might find relief in finally confronting what had been unspoken for decades. I was prepared for all of it, and in that preparedness, I found an unusual peace. The process unfolding before me was not instantaneous. Reflection is rarely immediate. It arrives in fragments, piecemeal, sometimes reluctantly. I could sense that each person in the room was piecing together their own understanding, revisiting past interactions and missteps, and evaluating what the envelope truly represented. It was not just information. It was a catalyst for recognition, a challenge to assumptions, and an invitation to reconcile the past with present awareness. I remembered the many times I had wished for clarity, the countless moments when words had failed, when conversations had devolved into arguments, and when silence had been filled with resentment rather than understanding. This time, everything was different. The envelope was not a weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting truths and gently forcing acknowledgement without confrontation. I could feel the subtle power of patience and subtlety in shaping outcomes far more profound than any heated argument could have achieved. Even as the minutes stretched, I could sense the room leaning toward acknowledgement, though no one had yet spoken aloud. The energy had shifted, curiosity had evolved into contemplation, and contemplation had begun to pave the way for understanding. I realized that the envelope had done more than deliver information. It had initiated a process, set in motion a series of reflections, and quietly challenged long-standing assumptions, allowing each person to arrive at their own insights in their own time. I sat quietly, absorbing the subtle transformations around me, aware that the real journey was just beginning. The envelope had set the stage, and now the task was patience, to watch, to allow reflection to flourish, and to witness the first moments when understanding might emerge from the shadows of silence. I felt a sense of cautious hope, knowing that even in the quiet, the beginnings of reconciliation, acknowledgement, and perhaps even healing were quietly taking shape. Could feel the subtle shift in the room, like a tide changing direction without warning. People were no longer just glancing at one another. They were thinking, calculating, revisiting old assumptions that had been ingrained over decades. The envelope had not only commanded attention, it had awakened dormant reflections, forcing each person to confront layers of expectation, entitlement, and unspoken guilt. The silence was heavy but transformative, as if the air itself carried the weight of all past grievances, waiting for someone to acknowledge them. I noticed my sister sitting slightly forward, her fingers nervously drumming against the armrest. She had always been the quiet one, the observer who rarely intervened in family disputes, yet here her stillness betrayed tension. I wondered what she was thinking. Was she considering how our shared past had shaped her reactions, or was she merely calculating her response for the right moment? Family gatherings often camouflage true feelings behind politeness, but the envelope had stripped that veneer away, revealing raw, unpolished truth. The more I watched, the more I realized the quiet itself had become a catalyst. It was teaching a lesson I had long learned. Confrontation isn't always necessary to provoke insight. The mere presence of truth, strategically delivered, can ignite introspection. I remembered times when harsh words had escalated arguments, causing irreparable fractures. Now, I witnessed the power of restraint. The envelope had spoken volumes without uttering a single sound, compelling reflection instead of immediate reaction. My gaze wandered to my nephew, who had recently returned from college. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression a mix of confusion and contemplation. Young adults often misunderstand the subtle dynamics that older generations navigate with nuance. They see conflict as direct and immediate, whereas life teaches us that some lessons are absorbed quietly over time. The envelope had created a pause, a space where each person could absorb the weight of past interactions and consider the consequences of their choices. I reflected on the irony that an object so simple, a sealed envelope, could disrupt the complex web of family dynamics more effectively than any confrontation or long speech. The contents were carefully curated, each word measured to provoke reflection rather than resentment. It reminded me of the power of deliberate action, how subtle, thoughtful gestures can initiate profound change without the need for dramatics or spectacle. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing the message would resonate without me needing to explain or defend it. The room remained hushed, but movement and expression began to betray the inner turmoil. My uncle leaned back, rubbing his temples, a signal I recognized from years of family gatherings as the precursor to reluctant acknowledgement. My cousin's eyes, once defiant, softened slightly, betraying an internal conflict I could almost feel emanating from across the room. The envelope had become more than paper. It was a mirror reflecting the nuances of relationships long strained by pride, silence, and misunderstanding. I remembered the years of subtle betrayals and overlooked sacrifices, how resentment had quietly accumulated, and how unspoken grievances often spoke louder than words ever could. Each family member seemed to be navigating their own emotional terrain, attempting to reconcile what they had always assumed with what was now undeniably clear. The envelope had transformed passive awareness into active reflection, forcing a reckoning that had long been overdue. There was a tangible sense of anticipation, as though everyone understood that once someone broke the silence, the atmosphere would shift irreversibly. I felt a mixture of apprehension and quiet hope. Confrontation was inevitable, but the outcome was uncertain. Would acknowledgement lead to understanding? Or would old grievances ignite anew? The balance between resolution and conflict felt delicate, like standing on the edge of a precipice, aware that a single step could determine the direction of what followed. I noticed my own hands resting on the envelope in my lap, still almost reverent. This simple object carried the potential to redefine our relationships, yet I remained calm. Patience had become a tool more powerful than any argument I could have made. I was learning, as I had countless times before, that timing and subtlety often dictate the impact of revelation far more than forceful declarations. The room seemed to breathe collectively, a shared anticipation that stretched across decades of unspoken assumptions and hidden motives. I could sense that some family members were beginning to silently evaluate their past behavior, contemplating choices that had contributed to the current state of affairs. Reflection had begun to take root, and with it, a potential for understanding that I had once thought impossible in such a brief moment. I considered the psychological weight of waiting, how silence can magnify awareness and intensify introspection. Each second seemed elongated, each glance and movement amplified, compelling recognition. The envelope was no longer just a message, it had become a vessel through which accountability and reflection could travel, gently, without confrontation. The subtlety of its impact amazed me. Even the most resistant family members seemed forced to grapple with truths they had long avoided. My thoughts returned to the past, to moments when misunderstanding had grown into resentment, and resentment into estrangement. I recognized that many of the fractures now quietly addressed had begun decades ago, rooted in assumptions and miscommunications. The envelope, by distilling complex histories into a simple act, had provided a rare opportunity for reflection, a chance to confront without accusation, to understand without judgment. I felt a sense of cautious optimism as the minutes stretched, knowing that the real work, the conversations, the acknowledgement, the reconciliation, was just beginning. The room had shifted from tension to reflection, a subtle but meaningful transformation that suggested the beginnings of change. I recognized that patience would continue to be crucial, and that the seeds planted by this small gesture might take time to bear fruit. I leaned back slightly, observing the quiet ripple of reflection across the room. The envelope had done its work, not by force, but through deliberate timing, careful phrasing, and the quiet power of expectation. I realized that sometimes the most profound impact comes from creating space for others to arrive at their own conclusions, to grapple with the weight of truth in their own way. It was an exercise in restraint, observation, and measured intervention, and the results, even this early, were undeniable. The tension in the room thickened as the seconds stretched. Everyone remained silent, yet each person seemed engaged in a private dialogue with themselves. I noticed subtle shifts, an eye twitch, a hand brushing against a tabletop, a small inhale betraying nervous anticipation. The envelope had set off a chain reaction, forcing everyone to confront both the past and the implications of what was about to unfold. I felt my own pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility I had assumed in choosing how to deliver it. Timing mattered more than the message itself. My mind wandered back to the days when family gatherings were simpler, before old grievances had calcified into unspoken rules. We laughed freely, and disagreements were brief, quickly dissolved into shared meals and stories. But over the years, unaddressed tension had quietly accumulated, layered atop each generation's pride and misunderstandings. The envelope, small and unassuming, seemed almost disproportionate in its power to evoke years of buried emotion. It was astonishing how a single act could unravel long-held patterns. I watched my older cousin, someone usually quick to dominate conversations with bravado, shift uncomfortably in their chair. For a moment I wondered if they felt threatened, or if they were grappling with a sudden self-awareness that had been absent for decades. I realized that the envelope wasn't just a message. It was a mirror, reflecting both personal responsibility and family history. Each subtle movement around the room revealed the invisible threads that tied us together, and the potential for healing if only we could acknowledge them. The silence was punctuated by almost imperceptible breaths, the kind that signal hesitation or internal conflict. My sister, usually composed and observant, had her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes scanning each face as though weighing past transgressions against potential forgiveness. I wondered if she recognized the envelope for what it truly represented. Not just words, but opportunity. Opportunity to reconcile, to confront, or even to claim agency in ways previously denied. I recalled instances from my own life where truth, delayed or concealed, had escalated conflict unnecessarily. Here, the envelope's careful timing seemed to encourage reflection rather than defensiveness. It was a reminder that patience and strategy could often achieve what confrontation alone could not. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the message was landing exactly as intended, stirring thought without inciting immediate anger. As I observed the room, I reflected on the complex dynamics that had guided each person's life choices. Our collective history was riddled with assumptions, judgments, and loyalties that were often unspoken but always influential. The envelope forced a reckoning with these patterns, subtly compelling each person to examine their own role in the web of relationships. I felt a cautious hope, realizing that acknowledgement could lead to meaningful understanding if handled with care. My gaze fell upon my youngest cousin, a teenager caught between admiration for adults and confusion at family politics. I sensed the envelope's impact on them as well, a subtle lesson in observation, patience, and discernment. They were witnessing the quiet power of truth, and I knew this moment could shape how they understood relationships, respect, and accountability in ways words alone could not. I noticed a faint shift in the atmosphere, a gentle ripple moving across the room as people began to lean subtly forward, drawn by curiosity and anticipation. The envelope's presence had transformed passive observation into active engagement. Each person's posture, expression, and attention reflected a growing awareness that the past could no longer remain unexamined. I felt a sense of calm urgency, understanding that the next step, the actual opening and acknowledgement, would define the trajectory of the conversation and perhaps our relationships. Memories surfaced, unexpectedly triggered by the quiet contemplation surrounding me. I thought of times when family members had misjudged intentions or allowed pride to dictate actions, creating rifts that seemed insurmountable. Each recollection was a reminder of how fragile relationships could be, and how easily small moments could compound into long-lasting tension. I understood that the envelope, though a single object, carried the weight of these experiences, offering a conduit for reconciliation, explanation, or at least acknowledgement. I reflected on my own feelings, anticipation, apprehension, and a quiet hope that the message would resonate without being misinterpreted. My responsibility in this moment was not only to deliver the envelope, but to allow it to speak in its own measured way. There was a delicate balance between timing, content, and the audience's readiness to receive it. I recognized that patience, even in tense moments, could transform confrontation into meaningful dialogue. The room seemed to shrink around me as attention sharpened. Each family member appeared suspended in thought, processing past grievances alongside the promise of new understanding. I realized that the envelope's significance was less about the material it contained and more about what it represented, the possibility of change, acknowledgement, and even redemption. It was a catalyst, subtle yet profound, capable of reshaping our interactions without overt confrontation. I considered the irony that silence could speak louder than words. Here, in a room filled with tension, restraint allowed the message to take root more effectively than any explanation or argument ever could. I felt a deep respect for the power of thoughtful action, recognizing that influence often manifests quietly and deliberately rather than forcefully. The anticipation of acknowledgement was palpable. I watched eyes flicker toward one another, searching for cues, seeking reassurance, or perhaps bracing for conflict. I realized that the envelope had created an environment in which honesty could emerge naturally, without provocation. The truth was present, undeniable, yet its impact would be dictated by the choices each person made in responding. I leaned back slightly, taking a breath to steady myself. The subtle tension reminded me of countless moments in my life when restraint had proven more effective than immediate reaction. Here, in this quiet anticipation, the envelope had become both a tool and a test of patience, perception, and emotional readiness. I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension, knowing that the next move, whoever it came from, would set the stage for what was to follow. The moment stretched longer than I expected. Each person in the room seemed suspended, caught between curiosity and trepidation. The envelope had created a quiet gravity that I hadn't anticipated. Even breaths felt amplified in the stillness. I could see subtle signs of tension in the way my siblings shifted in their seats, the slight tightening of jaws, the restless tapping of a foot. The silence itself was loud, pressing, as if the room were holding its collective breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. I recalled my own hesitation when first preparing the envelope. The act of placing the message inside had felt almost ceremonial, a delicate balance between disclosure and discretion. I had deliberated over the exact wording, the timing, and the delivery. Every detail mattered because I understood that once the envelope left my hands, it would take on a life of its own, shaping perceptions, stirring emotions, and inevitably influencing relationships. It was a small object, yet its impact was magnified by years of unresolved conflict and unspoken grievances. The atmosphere here was dense with expectation. I noticed my uncle glance sideways, perhaps trying to gauge my reaction or the reactions of others. My cousin fidgeted, their eyes darting between faces in a silent attempt to read unspoken cues. For a moment, I considered whether the contents of the envelope might provoke anger, disappointment, or relief. The uncertainty was almost tangible, and I felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. The envelope was more than a message. It was a catalyst, a trigger, a test of patience and understanding. I thought about the past, the quiet moments when small misunderstandings had snowballed into lasting tension. Years of pride, assumptions, and unspoken expectations had accumulated like sediment, settling in the corners of family interactions. The envelope now acted as a gentle yet persistent force, unsettling the sediment and demanding attention. I sensed that the room was beginning to recognize this shift, even if no one dared to speak yet. My sister's gaze lingered on me for a long moment. I could almost see the calculations behind her eyes, analyzing, predicting, wondering what the envelope might contain and how it might affect our fragile balance. There was a vulnerability in her expression, a recognition that the past and present were colliding in ways neither of us could fully control. I felt a pang of empathy, realizing that she, like me, had carried the weight of unspoken words for far too long. I remembered my own hesitations when weighing whether to keep the envelope a secret or to share it openly. Secrecy had a protective quality, but it could also become corrosive. By choosing to hold it for this moment, I was attempting to balance caution with accountability. The room, now fully aware of the envelope's presence, seemed to mirror my internal struggle. Every subtle gesture, glance, and movement reflected layers of anticipation, apprehension, and restrained emotion. As the seconds passed, I reflected on the lessons embedded in family dynamics. Relationships were rarely simple. They were built on a web of expectations, disappointments, and fleeting moments of connection. The envelope, though small and tangible, represented these complexities in concentrated form. Its significance lay not in its size but in the truths it carried, the opportunity it offered for reflection, and the potential to alter our interactions in a meaningful way. I caught sight of my cousin across the room, a young adult navigating the complexities of growing up in this family. Their eyes were wide with curiosity and subtle apprehension. I realized that they were observing more than the envelope itself. They were learning about the consequences of restraint, foresight, and carefully considered action. The impact of this moment extended beyond the immediate family members. It had the power to influence how younger generations perceived honesty, strategy, and respect. The silence persisted, yet it had shifted in texture. It was no longer merely passive. It carried a quiet anticipation, a sense that something essential was about to be acknowledged. Each subtle movement, shifting hands, a gentle clearing of the throat, a barely perceptible nod, felt amplified. I sensed that the envelope's contents had already begun to shape internal dialogues, stirring reflection and, perhaps, a readiness to confront long-held tensions. I thought back to my own reactions in similar situations throughout life. Moments of pause, careful observation, and measured action had often led to outcomes more constructive than impulsive responses. Here, in this room, the envelope created a space for such deliberation. The pause allowed each family member to consider not only the message but also their role in the unfolding narrative. I felt a cautious optimism, recognizing that patience could transform what might have been a confrontation into a deeper understanding. I observed my siblings exchanging subtle glances, the kind that communicate more than words ever could. The envelope had forced a shared reflection on history, choices, and responsibility. I realized that while the contents of the envelope were important, the reactions it elicited were equally revealing. Every gesture, every facial expression carried meaning, reflecting past grievances, unspoken feelings, and the potential for reconciliation. A sense of inevitability settled over the room. The envelope had done its work, demanding attention, stirring contemplation, and revealing the underlying dynamics that had shaped our relationships. I understood that the next step, when the contents would finally be acknowledged, would not only confirm these observations, but also set the stage for resolution or confrontation. I felt a mixture of apprehension and anticipation, knowing that the impact of this moment would ripple outward in ways we could not yet predict. Finally, I noticed a subtle shift in posture and expression among several family members. It was as if the envelope had transitioned from object to symbol, a representation of accountability, opportunity, and the delicate power of timing. I felt a quiet satisfaction, recognizing that the deliberate pause and measured delivery had amplified its significance, allowing for reflection rather than immediate reaction. Even as the envelope remained unopened, the room had already shifted. Conversations that had felt casual before now carried undercurrents of tension, each word weighed, each glance charged with expectation. I noticed my younger cousin in chains, G closer to the edge of their chair, curiosity battling caution. They had seen family disputes before, small sparks that ignited over trivial misunderstandings, but this was different. This moment felt deliberate, purposeful, as if the envelope itself contained not only answers but also a quiet challenge, one that demanded reflection before reaction. I remembered why I had chosen this particular day to deliver it. Timing was crucial. Too soon, and the message might be dismissed as impulsive. Too late, and it would lose its resonance, drowned in the routine of life. I had waited, watching for the precise alignment of circumstances that would allow its weight to be fully appreciated. The silence in the room now indicated that this timing had been correct. Everyone was primed to notice, to feel, and ultimately, to respond. As I watched my eldest sibling shift in their seat, I sensed a ripple of recognition. They understood the significance, even if they didn't yet know the contents. Years of accumulated frustration, pride, and expectation seemed to hover just beneath the surface, and the envelope had become a focal point for all of it. I could almost see their mind tracing possibilities, trying to anticipate the impact before it had even been revealed. I thought about the subtle power of restraint. By keeping the envelope in my hands until now, I had created a moment suspended between past and future. Every memory, every lingering slight, every unspoken word felt amplified. My sister's eyes, previously soft and calm, now glimmered with the tension of anticipation. She had no idea what I had written, what I had chosen to preserve for this moment, yet the very fact of my silence spoke volumes. It occurred to me that the envelope represented more than just a message. It was a mirror. In its quiet presence, each family member saw reflections of themselves, the impatience, the curiosity, the unacknowledged grievances. I noticed my uncle rubbing his chin, a subtle gesture that revealed his internal calculations. The younger cousins fidgeted, leaning toward one another for reassurance, while my siblings maintained poised, almost statuesque stillness. The contrast between outward composure and inward agitation fascinated me. I had long pondered whether moments like this should be orchestrated or left to chance. Over the years, I had witnessed disputes erupt in chaotic bursts, arguments over property, decisions, and inheritance that tore families apart. This envelope was an attempt to create clarity without confrontation, to reveal truth without immediate fallout. The strategy was simple: patience, observation, and a single, controlled gesture that demanded attention without forcing reaction. In the silence, memories began to surface. Conversations long forgotten, gestures of both kindness and neglect, moments that had shaped the family dynamic without anyone consciously acknowledging them. The envelope had triggered a cascade of reflection, a reminder of what had been ignored and what had been left unsaid. I realized that this pause, this deliberate suspension, was teaching more than the envelope ever could. It was offering an opportunity to reassess, to realign priorities, and perhaps to forgive before judgment. The eldest sibling shifted again, and I noticed the subtle signs of anxiety. Their hands were no longer steady, the foot tapping now a rhythmic heartbeat of internal tension. My sister inhaled sharply, as if preparing herself for what was to come. The younger cousins leaned forward, their wide-eyed curiosity mingling with a cautious hope. I felt the magnitude of responsibility pressing on me. This envelope was small, yet it carried the potential to alter the trajectory of relationships, perhaps permanently. I thought back to similar moments in my own life, moments when restraint had been both a burden and a gift. Holding back, waiting for the perfect alignment of circumstance, had often led to outcomes more measured and constructive than impulsive action ever could. Here, in this room, I recognized the same principle at work. The envelope was a tool, but it was also a teacher, showing us that timing, patience, and reflection could create space for understanding, even in the midst of tension. As the minutes stretched, the room began to exhale collectively, though no one spoke. It was as if the envelope had drawn out all unacknowledged emotion and suspended it between us, a delicate thread of expectation connecting each family member. I noticed subtle shifts in posture, fleeting eye contact, and the barely perceptible tightening or loosening of lips. These small gestures conveyed volumes, revealing internal calculations, hopes, fears, and the delicate balancing act of anticipation. I wondered how much each person had guessed about the envelope's purpose. Was there apprehension, a fear that the contents might challenge their assumptions or reveal overlooked truths? Or was there hope, a secret longing for clarity and acknowledgement? I could not tell. Each face was an unreadable map, presenting a mixture of restraint, anticipation, and uncertainty. I realized that the true power of the envelope lay not in what it contained, but in the way it forced reflection. I thought about the young cousins again, how they were witnessing a masterclass in family dynamics and strategic communication without fully realizing it. They were seeing firsthand how careful observation, timing, and measured action could influence behavior and prompt introspection. I felt a small sense of sati and satisfaction knowing that beyond immediate family resolution, this moment carried lessons for the next generation. I sensed the room had reached a tipping point. The envelope's presence had done its work, eliciting reflection, anticipation, and quiet analysis. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle shift in energy pointed toward an impending acknowledgement. The moment of revelation was imminent, and I felt both nervous and strangely calm. I had done my part. Now the unfolding responses would reveal not only the contents of the envelope, but also the true character and priorities of those around me. Finally, I considered the irony. Here was a single, small object holding the power to disrupt, clarify, and transform relationships. Yet its impact depended entirely on human perception and interpretation. The envelope itself was inert. It was the stories we carried, the memories we nurtured, and the tension we had allowed to accumulate that gave it life. In a way, the moment reminded me that family dynamics are always a mix of intention and interpretation, of timing and consequence, of silence and revelation. The first hand finally reached for the envelope, trembling slightly as if it carried not only paper, but the weight of every unspoken word between us. I watched closely, noting the tension in the shoulders, the the brief hesitation as if time itself had slowed to let the gravity of the moment sink in. Every eye in the room followed that hand, the collective breath held as anticipation thickened the air. I felt my own heartbeat steadying, a quiet reminder that the act of giving had already shifted something inside me. I had thought carefully about what I would say when the envelope was opened, but in this silence, words seemed almost superfluous. The room was suspended between the past and the present, and every glance and slight movement carried significance. My younger cousin leaned forward, curiosity gleaming in their eyes, while my eldest sibling's hands tightened in their lap. Even my quiet uncle, usually a pillar of detachment, showed a subtle shift, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. As the seal broke, the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have, a soft yet distinct tearing that amplified the significance of what was to come. I could feel the collective tension ripple across the room. This moment had been a long time coming, a culmination of years of restraint, patience, and careful observation. The envelope was more than paper. It had become a symbol of reflection, a controlled revelation that demanded acknowledgement without provocation. Inside, the note was simple yet pointed. I had written each word deliberately, shaping the message to speak truths that had been avoided for too long. The contents did not shout or accuse. They quietly illuminated what had been neglected, what had been assumed, and what had remained unspoken. I wanted the impact to be felt in the pause, in the consideration, in the slow unraveling of understanding rather than immediate confrontation. As they read, I noticed the small, almost imperceptible shifts in posture, the micro-expressions that betrayed a mix of surprise, introspection, and, in some cases, discomfort. The words had landed as intended, forcing each person to reconcile past actions with present awareness. My sister's eyes glistened briefly, betraying emotion that she had not yet articulated, while the younger cousins exchanged quick glances, silently processing the gravity of the message. I remembered a time years ago when a single gesture had sparked more conflict than 1,000 words. This time, I wanted to invert that experience. Instead of confrontation, I offered reflection. Instead of immediate reaction, I created space for thought. The envelope was both catalyst and container, holding tension while directing it into introspection rather than chaos. It was a deliberate act of subtle power, a quiet insistence that the past and its oversights could not be ignored. In the quiet that followed, I realized the room was alive with a different energy. It was not the noisy discord of disagreement, but a palpable engagement with truth. Everyone's attention was anchored on the letter, yet it seemed to also anchor them to their own memories, choices, and unresolved feelings. I felt a wave of relief, tempered by the awareness that this was only the beginning of processing. The envelope had opened a door, and each family member had to step through at their own pace. I recalled moments when silence had been misinterpreted, when restraint had been taken for passivity, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that this time the silence had power. The room's stillness was not absence, but presence, a shared acknowledgement that what lay in the envelope deserved careful consideration. Even my uncle, often skeptical of emotional expression, shifted slightly, signaling engagement rather than dismissal. I reflected on the subtle artistry of timing and patience. Every moment leading up to this, every careful choice of when to hand over the envelope, every calculation of observation and restraint had culminated here. The silence allowed the message to land fully, without distraction or distortion. The power of measured action, I realized, could create far deeper understanding than any heated argument ever could. Gradually, the first words were spoken, soft and tentative, yet resonant. The letter had prompted not immediate defense, but dialogue, questions, and acknowledgement. My sister's voice, usually reserved, carried a new weight, a quiet recognition of what had been neglected or misunderstood. My eldest sibling asked clarifying questions, not in accusation, but in genuine attempt to understand, and the younger cousins, absorbing every nuance, seemed to grasp the significance of patience, reflection, and deliberate communication. In observing these reactions, I felt the full measure of the envelope's intent realized. It was a conduit for honesty, a mirror reflecting both strengths and oversights within the family. I recognized, with a quiet sense of fulfillment, that the act of giving had also given space for reconciliation, for acknowledgement, and perhaps for beginning to repair subtle fractures that had endured for years. The message, though simple in form, had achieved a complexity of impact that I had hoped for. It allowed each individual to confront their own assumptions, to recognize the subtle ways in which neglect, oversight, or misunderstanding had influenced our relationships. And in doing so, it provided a foundation for change that was thoughtful, intentional, and profoundly human. As the room gradually settled, I felt an inner calm. The envelope had done its work, not by force, not through confrontation, but through careful orchestration, observation, and patience. The first wave of reflection was over, yet the deeper currents of understanding had only begun to move. I sensed that what we had all glimpsed in that quiet, charged moment would reverberate long after the paper was set aside. And so, as I watched the family begin to process, discuss, and, in some cases, quietly reconcile with what had been revealed, I realized the power of preparation, of patience, and of choosing when to speak. The envelope had been a catalyst, yes, but it was also a teacher, reminding us all that timing, thoughtfulness, and subtlety could transform not only moments, but the very fabric of relationships. After the initial reactions had settled into contemplative murmurs, I noticed subtle shifts in body language that spoke louder than any words. My uncle leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in careful consideration. My sister fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve as if weighing whether to respond immediately or let the silence stretch a little longer. Every small gesture seemed magnified in the room's charged atmosphere, and I felt the full weight of years compressed into these moments of observation. I remembered the countless family dinners where unspoken tensions lingered in the air, conversations interrupted by polite distractions or forced smiles. Each suppressed argument, each avoidance of direct acknowledgement had compounded silently over the years. In this room now, those layers of avoidance had nowhere to hide. The envelope had served as both mirror and spotlight, reflecting truths we all knew but had hesitated to confront. As questions began to emerge, tentative and careful, I realized that the room had shifted from passive observation to active engagement. My eldest sibling's voice broke the silence first, measured and deliberate, asking about my intentions in writing what I did. I could feel their internal struggle, wanting to challenge, yet hesitant to speak too harshly. My response, calm and precise, was less about defending myself and more about inviting reflection. I wanted each person to arrive at their own understanding rather than feel coerced into agreement. The younger cousins, normally boisterous and quick to joke, remained unusually subdued. Their curiosity was evident, but it was tempered by a newfound awareness of the gravity surrounding the envelope. I caught their glances toward one another, a silent exchange as if to confirm shared comprehension. This moment of collective introspection was rare, and I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, recognizing that patience and timing had guided us here. I recalled a particular memory of my father, stern yet quietly observant, who had always believed that truth revealed itself over time rather than through force. I realized that in many ways, I had inherited that approach. The envelope was not about creating spectacle or immediate reaction. It was about fostering understanding and allowing each individual to confront the reality of their actions, however subtly or painfully. Gradually, dialogue deepened. My sister began sharing insights from her own perspective, acknowledging past misunderstandings and expressing remorse for moments she had overlooked. The eldest sibling followed, offering a measured reflection on past decisions and the way those had impacted our family dynamic. Even my uncle, ever skeptical of emotional display, contributed quietly, reinforcing the sense that this was more than a simple gesture. It was a pivotal opportunity for reconciliation and clarity. I could sense the tension in the room evolve from unease to contemplation. Each member was weighing their own memories against the insights prompted by the envelope. I noticed that even small acknowledgments, a nod, a fleeting smile, a softened expression, signaled a subtle shift in collective consciousness. The power of measured truth was manifesting not through confrontation, but through introspective recognition. At one point, I caught myself reflecting on why I had waited so long to take this action. The years of observation, the patience required to understand how each individual might respond, and the careful crafting of the message had been essential. Any hasty delivery would have been lost in defensiveness or misunderstanding. By choosing timing and wording carefully, I had created a moment that encouraged not immediate reaction, but considered reflection. I could see the room's energy begin to settle into a rhythm of shared understanding. Conversations became less about accusation and more about clarification. My presence, calm and deliberate, seemed to anchor these exchanges, allowing for measured responses rather than impulsive reactions. Each statement, each pause, contributed to a gradual reconstruction of trust that had been fragile but not irreparably broken. As I watched, I realized the subtle power of presence and restraint. It was not the envelope alone, but the combination of timing, observation, and deliberate calm that created space for meaningful dialogue. The message had landed, but the deeper work of connection and reconciliation had begun, quietly and thoughtfully. By the end of this period, I sensed a new equilibrium. The family had shifted from tentative observation to engaged reflection. There was still work to be done, questions to explore, and unresolved tensions to navigate. But the first step had been taken. The envelope had not simply delivered information. It had created a framework for growth, understanding, and, ultimately, subtle reconciliation. I felt a profound mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the act had been received as intended. Anticipation for the ongoing process of dialogue and healing. I understood now that this was only a chapter in our family story, one that required continued attention, patience, and a willingness to engage with both discomfort and clarity. The envelope had opened a door, but walking through it with integrity and awareness would be an ongoing commitment for all of us. And so, as the room gradually returned to a quieter rhythm, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. The deliberate timing, careful crafting, and patient delivery of the message had achieved something remarkable, a shared recognition of our past, present, and the potential for future understanding. The weight of years was lightened not by dramatic confrontation, but through measured action, subtle insight, and the quiet courage to let truth speak in its own time. The room had gradually returned to a quiet hum of subdued conversation, yet I sensed the invisible threads of tension that still lingered. Every glance and slight shift in posture seemed to carry the weight of years, unspoken regrets, and lingering misunderstandings. Even as we collectively absorbed the impact of the envelope, I realized that closure wasn't immediate. It was a process, delicate and unhurried, requiring each of us to reckon with our own perspectives before any real reconciliation could unfold. I reflected on the journey to this moment, the careful deliberation in preparing the envelope, the timing of its delivery, and the subtle guidance of my lawyer had all contributed to creating a space where truth could land without sparking chaos. It wasn't a confrontation I sought, but a moment of clarity, an invitation for each family member to engage with honesty and introspection. The fact that the room had responded with measured engagement rather than immediate conflict felt like the first true victory. As the discussion unfolded, I noticed small yet significant shifts. My sister, who had previously been rigid in her assumptions, softened visibly, her expressions now a blend of contemplation and tentative understanding. The eldest sibling, often quick to assert authority, began to listen with unusual patience, interjecting only when necessary and in ways that encouraged reflection rather than defensiveness. Even my uncle, stoic and often distant, acknowledged quietly that the timing of my actions had been critical. Each acknowledgement was like a ripple, expanding the impact of a single gesture far beyond its initial moment. I recalled the long nights spent wrestling with my own doubts. Would the message be received as intended? Could the family handle the truths laid bare without fracturing further? The envelope, though a simple object in form, carried the cumulative weight of years of observation, sacrifice, and careful strategy. Its effectiveness depended not on drama or spectacle, but on subtlety, precision, and the courage to let others confront their own reflections. Gradually, the tone of the room shifted. Conversations became more introspective, less reactive. Questions were asked not to challenge, but to understand. Insights were shared, bridging gaps that had seemed insurmountable for years. The power of patience became evident. By withholding immediate judgment and creating space for thought, I had transformed a potentially volatile situation into a turning point for meaningful dialogue. I could see the emotional evolution unfold in real time. The younger cousins, once uncertain, now spoke more openly, expressing feelings they had never articulated before. Even the family members who had initially reacted with suspicion began to connect the dots between past events and present intentions. There was no grand declaration of reconciliation, no dramatic speeches, just quiet acknowledgement, shared reflection, and the first tentative steps toward mutual understanding. I found myself reflecting on what this moment meant for me personally. For years, I had carried the burden of observation, often feeling isolated in my awareness of family dynamics. The act of delivering the envelope was less about control and more about empowerment, not just for myself, but for the family as a whole. By creating a space for measured confrontation, I allowed each person to see themselves clearly, fostering accountability without hostility. The conversations deepened, touching on memories long buried. My siblings recounted moments of misunderstanding, moments of miscommunication, and moments when they had wished for guidance they never sought. I shared my own reflections, balancing honesty with restraint, ensuring that the dialogue remained constructive rather than accusatory. In that balance, I found a profound sense of satisfaction. The envelope had not simply delivered information. It had opened the door to reconciliation and growth. Time seemed to slow as the family collectively absorbed the implications of the exchange. There were no immediate resolutions, no magical fixes, but the seeds of understanding had been planted. Each person left the room with a sense of contemplation, a personal recognition of the past, and a renewed sense of responsibility for how we would move forward. It was a quiet victory, one that required patience to fully appreciate, but its significance was unmistakable. I observed the subtle gestures of acknowledgement, nods, fleeting smiles, quiet affirmations that signaled progress. These small moments were more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could have been. They represented the careful cultivation of trust, the slow reconstruction of relationships, and the recognition that meaningful change occurs through reflection and intention rather than force. As the room finally began to disperse, I felt a profound mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the envelope had achieved its intended purpose, and anticipation for the continuing process of dialogue and understanding. The act itself was only a first step, but it was a step that had already altered the trajectory of our family's dynamic. It reminded me that patience, careful observation, and deliberate action often have a more lasting impact than any immediate, forceful gesture. In the stillness that followed, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the lessons embedded in this experience. The power of timing, the courage to confront indirectly, and the willingness to let others arrive at insight on their own terms, all these elements had converged to create a pivotal moment in our family story. It was a testament to the idea that even the quietest gestures can carry tremendous weight when executed thoughtfully and intentionally. And so, as I gathered my own thoughts and prepared to leave, I carried with me the reassurance that the envelope had not simply conveyed information, it had initiated a journey that would continue beyond this day, requiring patience, understanding, and continued dialogue. The true impact would unfold gradually, but the foundation had been laid, a foundation built on reflection, honesty, and the subtle courage to act without fanfare. I sat there long after the room emptied, the weight of what had happened pressing on my chest. The papers I handed over were more than just legal documents. They were the quiet assertion of my dignity, the proof that respect can't be demanded, only earned. I thought of all the years of compromise, the sacrifices I had made silently, the moments I had let go of my own voice to preserve the illusion of harmony. And yet, in that stillness, I felt a quiet triumph. My choices, once doubted and challenged, had finally spoken louder than anger or entitlement. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about reclaiming my life, my self-respect, and the clarity that comes from standing firm when it matters most. And if you've ever wondered what it feels like to turn the tables in ways nobody sees coming, there's a story waiting that takes this idea even further, where quiet decisions ripple into shocking revelations, changing everything in ways you never anticipate. Click through and see how a seemingly simple choice can shift the balance of family, loyalty, and respect, leaving everyone to reckon with the consequences in ways they never imagined.